The man collapsed face first on the cold hospital floor, and the security guard stepped over him like an inconvenience. No one screamed. No one ran. The sound that filled the emergency room was not panic, but paperwork. Printers hummed, monitors beeped, shoes squeaked on polished tile. Somewhere a television murmured a daytime talk show no one was watching. The man lay still, cheek pressed to the floor, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, breath shallow and uneven. At the intake desk, a nurse looked up, assessed the scene in half a second, then looked back down at her screen. "He fainted," she said flatly to no one in particular. "Get him a chair when you have time." The man did not move. He was 61, gray at the temples, tall in a way that suggested he had once been broader, stronger. His coat was plain, not cheap, not expensive, just plain. His shoes were scuffed. His hands trembled when he tried to push himself up, fingers sliding on the floor, leaving faint streaks of moisture. Sweat or blood. It was hard to tell. Across the room, a woman clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Her name badge read, Linda Morales, Volunteer Services. Late 50s. Hair pulled tight, lips thinner than usual. She had been helping an elderly couple fill out insurance forms when the man went down. She saw it all. The way his knees buckled. The way his eyes rolled back. The way the guard didn't even slow his stride. Linda took one step forward, then stopped. Her mouth opened, closed. She glanced toward the intake desk, toward the uniform, toward the unspoken rules of the room. Someone should she started. A second nurse cut her off without looking up. "Ma'am, please stay in your lane." Linda flushed. She nodded the way people nod when they've been reminded of their place. She stepped back, heart-pounding guilt burning hot in her chest. The man tried again to rise. A low sound escaped his throat. Not a word. A sound of effort. Pain. He dragged one knee under him, then froze as a sharp spasm tore through his chest. His vision narrowed. The ceiling lights blurred into white streaks. He had felt this coming all morning. It had started in the parking lot, a tightness just below the sternum. A pressure that didn't belong. He told himself it was stress. He told himself he'd waited too long for breakfast. He told himself to breathe. He always told himself to breathe. By the time he reached the emergency room, his left arm was numb. At the desk, a young man in a wrinkled hoodie leaned over, voice raised. "I've been waiting 2 hours," he snapped. "I'm bleeding." The receptionist sighed, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Sir, lower your voice. There are people worse off than you." The man on the floor laughed once, a short, breathless sound that startled even him. "People worse off." A stretcher rolled past, pushed by a pair of orderlies arguing quietly about lunch. One of them glanced down at the man, eyes flicking over the coat, the shoes, the lack of a wedding ring. He shrugged. "Probably drunk," he muttered. The words landed heavier than the fall. The man closed his eyes. He focused on counting his breaths. In, out. The way he had learned years ago in rooms far quieter than this. Rooms where mistakes cost more than pride, where people listened when he spoke. A memory intruded sharp and unwelcome. His father sitting at a kitchen table in Ohio, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. If you don't look important, his father had said, they won't hear you. That's just how it is. The man had believed him for a long time. Across the room, a woman in her late 30s paced near the vending machine's phone pressed to her ear. "They said he has to wait," she hissed. "I don't care if it's policy. He's gray, he's sweating. This isn't a hangnail." She listened, jaw tightening. Fine. I'll call someone else." She lowered the phone and looked around, eyes scanning faces, searching for help, authority, anything. Her gaze landed on the man on the floor. Their eyes met for half a second. She looked away just as quickly, fear flickering across her face. She did not want to be involved. The security guard returned, finally dragging a plastic chair by one leg. It scraped loudly. He nudged the man's shoulder with his foot. "Hey, sit up," the man tried. Failed. "I said sit up." "Please," the man whispered. The word surprised him. He hadn't meant to say it. He hadn't said that word in years. The guard rolled his eyes. "Don't get dramatic." From behind the intake desk, a senior nurse finally stood. Her name was Carol Whitman, 52. Efficient, tired. She had seen everything, or thought she had. She walked over, crouched, checked the man's pulse with 2 fingers, quick and impersonal. "Blood pressure's low," she said. "What's your name?" The man hesitated. Names mattered. Names opened doors. Names closed them. "Jack," he said finally. "Jack Harris." Carol nodded, already losing interest. "Do you have insurance?" "Jack." Jack smiled faintly. It was almost funny. "Yes," he said. "Very good insurance," she snorted. "Everyone says that." She stood. "Get him a wheelchair when one's free," when Linda asked before she could stop herself. Carol turned eyes sharp. "When we have one." Linda swallowed. She looked down at Jack, at the way his hand clenched and unclenched, at the sheen of sweat along his hairline. "He doesn't look okay," she said softly. Carol's expression hardened. "Ma'am, this is not your call." Jack closed his eyes again. The room felt smaller, louder. He felt the edges of control slipping, and that frightened him more than the pain. Control had always been his currency, his armor. A sudden wave of dizziness hit stronger than before. His chest tightened. His breath hitched. The beeping of a nearby monitor grew louder in his ears, syncing with his pulse, then falling out of rhythm. He thought of a boardroom in Manhattan, of a long table, of men and women who went silent when he cleared his throat. He thought of the weight of decisions, of signatures that moved markets, of consequences that rippled outward into lives he would never meet. And here on this floor, none of that mattered. His hand slid across the tile and brushed against Linda's shoe. She flinched, then slowly crouched, ignoring Carol's glare. She met Jack's eyes. Really met them. "You're not invisible," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Jack looked at her surprised. There was gratitude there. And something else. A flicker of resolve buried deep, beginning to stir. Across the room, a man in a tailored navy blazer stood from his seat near the wall. He had been there the whole time, quiet, watching. Mid-60s, silver hair, calm eyes. He took in the scene with a stillness that did not belong in chaos. He did not rush. He did not shout. He took one deliberate step forward, and the room, without knowing why, began to change. The man in the navy blazer did not raise his voice yet. The nurse nearest him turned as if summoned by instinct. He stopped beside Jack's feet, close enough that the hem of his blazer brushed the scuffed toe of Jack's shoe. He looked down, not with alarm, not with pity, but with the kind of attention people reserve for things that matter. His eyes tracked Jack's breathing, the slight tremor in his hand, the sheen of sweat along his neck. He noted the way Jack tried to straighten when someone approached, the reflex of a man long trained to appear fine. "How long has he been on the floor?" the man asked. The question was simple. The tone was not. Carol Whitman answered without thinking. "A few minutes." Linda shook her head before fear could stop her. "It's been longer. At least 10. Carol shot her a warning look. "Ma'am!" The man in the blazer raised one finger. "Not high, not dramatic, just enough." Carol stopped talking. The man crouched with care, knees bending slowly as if mindful of his own age. He did not touch Jack. Not yet. "Sir," he said, voice low and steady. "Can you hear me?" Jack forced his eyes open. The ceiling lights blurred, then steadied. He focused on the man's face. There was something familiar there. Not recognition. Gravity. "Yes," Jack whispered. "Good." The man nodded once. "Stay with me. Don't try to stand." Carol exhaled sharply. "Sir, we have procedures." The man looked up at her then, fully. His gaze was calm, but it stripped the air of excuses. "So do heart attacks." That word rippled through the room. A few heads turned. The young man at the desk stopped tapping his foot. The woman by the vending machines lowered her phone. Carol stiffened. "You're not a physician." "No," the man said. "But I know what low blood pressure looks like in a man his age who is sweating through wool." He placed 2 fingers gently at Jack's wrist, measured patient, counted. His brow tightened just slightly. "Get a monitor," he said. "Now." The guard hesitated, looked to Carol. Carol hesitated too. Authority flickered, then recalibrated. "Do it!" she snapped. The guard jogged off. Jack tried to smile. It came out crooked. "You didn't have to," he murmured. The man leaned closer just enough that Jack could hear him over the noise. "I know." That answer unsettled Jack more than the pain. The guard returned with a portable monitor. A nurse followed, younger eyes wide. They worked quickly now, movements sharper, voices clipped. The screen flickered to life. Numbers appeared. The nurse sucked in a breath. "That's not good." Carol swore under her breath. "Get a gurney! Clear a room!" The room shifted. Chairs scraped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Jack felt hands at his shoulders, firm now, careful. The man in the blazer stepped back to give them space, but did not leave. He watched every movement, every decision. As they lifted Jack onto the gurney, pain flared white-hot across his chest. He gasped, fingers clawing at the thin sheet. "I've got you," the man said quietly. He placed a hand on the rail. Solid, present, breathe. Jack did. Or tried to. They wheeled him toward the hall, past the intake desk, past the television still murmuring about celebrity divorces. Linda stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Jack met her eyes as he passed. "Thank you," he mouthed. She nodded, tears burning, unsure why her chest felt so tight. They pushed through double doors into the back corridor. The sounds changed. Sharper, louder. The smell of antiseptic thickened. Carol walked fast now, barking orders. "Call cardiology. Prep for imaging." "We're not waiting." The younger nurse glanced back, confused. "Shouldn't we—" Carol cut her off. "Just move." The man in the blazer followed until the doors to the treatment area blocked his path. He stopped there, hands folding loosely in front of him. He did not pace. He did not fidget. He waited. A physician in a white coat nearly collided with him. Mid-40s, tired eyes, coffee breath. "Sir, you can't be back here." The man smiled faintly. Not warmth. Courtesy. "I'll wait right here." The physician opened his mouth to argue, then paused. Something in the man's posture gave him second thoughts. He nodded once and hurried past. Minutes stretched. 10. 15. Time did strange things in that hallway. Every beep from behind the doors felt amplified. A nurse burst out breathless, pushing a cart. "Clear," she snapped. The man stepped aside smoothly, like he had anticipated the move. A janitor paused with his mop eyes darting. "What happened?" The man met his gaze. A man was ignored. The janitor swallowed and moved on. Finally, the doors opened again. Carol emerged, mask, pulled down hair damp at her temples. She looked shaken. She did not see the man at first. Then she did, her face drained of color. "Mr. Hale," she said. The name landed like a dropped tray. The physician slowed mid-step. The janitor stopped outright. The nurse with the cart stared. "Yes," Richard Hale said. "It's me." Carol straightened too late. "I didn't realize," No, Richard said. "You didn't." She swallowed. "He's stable. For now. Severe blockage. Another hour and—" She stopped herself. "And you would have written a different report," Richard finished calmly. Silence pressed in. Carol's shoulders sagged. "We're taking him upstairs." "Cath lab." Richard nodded. "Good." She hesitated, then forced the words out. "I'm sorry." Richard looked past her through the doors to where Jack lay, surrounded by machines and hands and urgency. "So is he said. Carol followed his gaze, shame tightening her mouth. He said his name was Jack Harris. Richard's eyes did not move. "It is. And the insurance," she added, desperate now. "It's extensive." Richard almost smiled. "It usually is." She flinched. They wheeled Jack past again, faster this time. His eyes were half open, unfocused. As he passed Richard, his hand lifted weakly. Richard caught it without hesitation. Jack's grip was faint but insistent. "You stayed," Jack whispered. Richard leaned close. "I always do." Jack's eyes searched his face, confusion cutting through the fog. "You didn't tell them." "No." Why? Richard straightened slowly. "Because if they need a name to do their job, then the job is already broken." Jack's mouth twitched. A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sob. Then he was gone, swallowed by doors and motion. Richard stood alone in the corridor. Behind him, voices began to rise again, softer, now edged with speculation. Someone whispered his name. Someone else pulled out a phone. Richard did not turn around. He took out his own phone, old-fashioned, no case. He dialed a number from memory. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "We have a problem here. Not a legal one. A human one." He listened, eyes steady, jaw set. "Yes," he said. "All of it." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The hospital continued to hum, unaware that its quiet routines had just been noticed by someone who did not forget, did not forgive easily, and never mistook indifference for accident. And upstairs, as surgeons worked against time, a man who had spent his life being heard lay fighting to stay alive in a place that had almost decided he was not worth listening to at all. Jack woke to silence that felt expensive. Not the hollow quiet of an empty room, but the padded stillness of thick curtains, soft lighting, and machines designed to whisper instead of scream. His eyelids fluttered. The ceiling above him was smooth, uncracked, a pale color chosen to calm people who were not calm. His chest felt tight, wrapped sore in a way that radiated outward with every breath. A dull ache pulsed beneath his ribs, steady, insistent. He tried to move his hand. It responded slowly. "Easy," a voice said from the left. Jack turned his head an inch. The movement sent a spike of pain through his shoulder, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still here. The man in the navy blazer sat in a chair pulled close to the bed jacket, folded neatly over the back sleeves of his shirt rolled to mid-forearm. He looked exactly as Jack remembered from the hallway. Calm, unhurried, watching. "How long?" Jack asked. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by tubes and effort. "Long enough," the man said. "You scared them." Jack huffed weakly. "That's new." The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "You made it through surgery. They placed 2 stents. You're alive because someone finally stopped pretending you weren't. Jack closed his eyes for a second. The weight of those words settled heavy in his chest, heavier than the pain. You stayed. Yes. Why? The man leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Because people leave too easily. Jack studied him. Really studied him now. The lines around his eyes earned not by age alone, but by vigilance. The stillness that wasn't passive. The kind that suggested decisions made quietly and carried out thoroughly. I know you, Jack said suddenly. The man raised an eyebrow. Do you? Jack's gaze sharpened. I've seen you across tables, at conferences, in reports that pretend not to mention your name while orbiting it. He swallowed. Richard Hale. Richard did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. He simply nodded once. Jack exhaled. You could have said something. I did, Richard said. Eventually. That's not what I meant. Richard stood, walked to the window, pulled the curtain back a few inches. Afternoon light slipped into the room, soft and gray. If I had spoken sooner, he said, you would have been treated because of me, not because you were a man in trouble. Jack followed his silhouette with his eyes. And you wanted to know which one mattered. I already knew, Richard said quietly. I wanted them to learn. Jack's jaw tightened. He looked away. They almost didn't. Richard turned back. I know. A knock interrupted them. 2 soft taps controlled. A woman stepped in without waiting for permission. Late 40s, crisp blouse, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had once been less careful and learned not to be again. Her badge read, Dana Keene Hospital Administration. She stopped short when she saw Richard. Mr. Hale, she said. Her voice held respect edged with strain. I didn't realize you were still here. I'm not, Richard said. I'm where I should be. Dana glanced at Jack, then back to Richard. We need to talk. Richard checked his watch. You have 5 minutes. Dana nodded, professional reflex kicking in. She moved closer to the bed, hands clasped. Mr. Harris, I'm glad to see you awake. Jack met her gaze. I'll let you know when that matters. She flinched just enough to notice. There's been a review. Already, Jack asked. Dana hesitated. Preliminary. Richard's eyes hardened. You don't do preliminary reviews for janitors who slip on stairs. Dana's lips pressed thin. No. You do them for risk, Richard continued. And for exposure. She held his gaze. Both. Jack shifted, wincing. I didn't ask for an investigation. Dana turned to him. With respect, sir, you didn't need to. Richard stepped closer to the bed presence filling the room. Tell me what you found. Dana inhaled. There were delays, misjudgments, a failure to escalate. Language, Richard said flatly. She swallowed. People chose not to act. Silence stretched. Jack's fingers curled against the sheet. Who? Richard asked. Dana's eyes flicked to the door, then back. Several staff members, including one attending. Jack closed his eyes. A face rose in his mind. A voice, flat, dismissive. Carol Whitman, he said. Dana nodded. She's been placed on leave. Richard nodded once. Good. Dana bristled. This isn't Richard cut her off. It's not about punishment, it's about pattern. She exhaled. There's more. Richard waited. Dana lowered her voice. This isn't the first time. Jack's eyes opened. What do you mean? She looked at him directly now. There have been complaints, near misses, people who waited longer than they should have, people who were sent home and came back worse. Jack's chest tightened for reasons that had nothing to do with surgery, and nothing changed. Dana shook her head. Not until now. Richard's voice was quiet. What changed? She met his eyes. You were in the room. Richard turned away. The reflection in the window fractured his face into pale shapes. That's the wrong answer. Dana stiffened. It's the honest one. Jack watched them both. Two forces colliding in a space too small to contain what was coming. What happens next? He asked. Dana hesitated. The board will meet. When Richard asked, tonight. Richard checked his watch again. Move it. Dana blinked. Sir. Move it to now, he said. People don't die on a schedule. Accountability shouldn't either. She hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. Richard's gaze sharpened. You'll do it. Dana left without another word. Jack let out a slow breath. You enjoy this. Richard turned back, expression unreadable. I don't enjoy anything about hospitals. Jack studied him. Then why stay involved? Richard's jaw tightened. For a moment the mask slipped. Just a fraction. Because my brother died in one. Jack's breath caught. Years ago, Richard continued. Different city, same excuses. Jack swallowed. I'm sorry. Richard nodded once. So am I. A nurse entered then, brisk, efficient. She checked Jack's vitals, adjusted a drip, avoided eye contact with Richard entirely. When she finished, she hesitated. You're lucky, she said to Jack. Jack met her gaze. No, I was heard. She flushed and left. The room settled again. The light shifted, shadows lengthening across the floor. Jack broke the silence. They think I'm someone else. Richard's eyes flicked to him. Do they think I matter now, Jack said, because of you. Richard considered that. Do you? Jack laughed softly, then winced. I spent my life making sure I mattered in rooms that didn't want me. Then I walked into one that didn't care either way. He looked at Richard. Turns out the two aren't that different. Richard nodded slowly. Power doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. Jack closed his eyes, exhaustion rolling over him in waves. What are you going to do? Richard stood, retrieving his jacket. I'm going to ask questions. And if they don't like the answers, Richard's smile this time was thin and cold. Then they'll learn too. He paused at the door hand on the handle. Rest. You'll need your strength. For what Jack asked. Richard looked back. For the part where this stops being just about you. The door closed behind him. Jack lay there, heart pounding, aware for the first time that surviving the surgery might have been the smallest part of what was coming next. The boardroom lights were too bright for the hour, casting sharp reflections across the polished table as if the room itself were on trial. Richard Hale took the seat at the far end without asking. He placed his phone face down, folded his hands, and waited. The chairs filled slowly. Men and women in tailored suits, some still clutching coffee, some pretending calm they did not feel. The air smelled of impatience and money and fear. Dana Keene entered last and closed the door behind her. We're all here, she said. Her voice carried authority, but it wavered at the edges. An older man cleared his throat. Chairman Thomas Becker, 72. A career built on quiet consensus and careful avoidance. Mr. Hale, he began this meeting, was called on extremely short notice. Richard looked at him without blinking. So was the heart attack. A ripple moved around the table. A woman shifted in her chair. Someone else reached for water and missed the glass. Becker forced a thin smile. We take patient safety very seriously. Richard leaned back. The chair did not creak. You take liability seriously. There's a difference, Dana interjected quickly. Let's stay focused. We've all reviewed the preliminary. No, Richard said calmly. We haven't. Donna froze. Richard turned his gaze to the room. You've reviewed a version designed to protect this institution. I'm interested in the version that explains why a man with active cardiac distress lay on your emergency room floor while staff debated protocol. Becker bristled. That characterization is unfair. Richard's eyes narrowed. Is it inaccurate silence? A younger board member, Dr. Malcolm Reeves, finally spoke. There was an assessment. The patient was conscious. He answered questions. He collapsed, Richard said. Twice. Reeves flushed. We can't respond to every fainting episode as a code. Richard nodded slowly. Then perhaps you should ask yourselves why you assumed it was fainting. Reeves opened his mouth, closed it. Dana inhaled. We are conducting a full internal investigation. Richard's voice remained level. Internal investigations are how patterns survive. Becker leaned forward, finger steepled. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Hale? Richard met his gaze. I'm proposing sunlight. A murmur rippled through the room. Becker's smile faltered. You're suggesting publicity. I'm suggesting accountability, Richard said. Public accountability. Dana shook her head. That would damage trust. No, Richard corrected. Secrecy damages trust. Exposure rebuilds it. Another board member, Evelyn Grant, late 60s, spoke quietly. You were present. You intervened. The outcome was positive. Richard turned to her. The outcome was not positive. The outcome was delayed survival. She flinched. Richard continued, voice steady, inexorable. The patient lived because I refused to leave, not because your systems worked. Becker's jaw tightened. What do you want? The question hung heavy. Richard did not answer immediately. He took a breath slow and measured. I want names. Dana stiffened. That's not appropriate. I want timelines. That's sensitive information. I want recorded statements. Becker slammed a hand on the table. This is turning into a witch hunt. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not move. Witch hunts punish the innocent. This identifies the negligent. The room went still. Richard's phone buzzed once. He glanced at it, then slid it toward Dana. That was my office. The press has been informed that I am attending an emergency board meeting regarding a patient safety failure. They're asking questions. Becker paled. You went to the press already? Richard shook his head. I answered a question honestly. Dana swallowed hard. We need to control the narrative. Richard looked at her. Then change the story. Becker sagged back in his chair. What would that look like? Richard stood. The room stilled instinctively. It looks like this, Richard said. You issue a public acknowledgement by morning. You admit failure without euphemism. You place the attending physician and supervising nurse on unpaid suspension pending review. You create an independent oversight committee with real authority, not decorative titles. You implement mandatory escalation training effective immediately. And you invite the patient to address this board when he is medically cleared. Reeves scoffed. You want him in here? Yes, Richard said. I want you to see him. Evelyn Grant nodded slowly. That seems fair. Becker rubbed his temples. And if we refuse, Richard met his gaze. Then tomorrow afternoon I release footage. The word footage landed like a dropped plate. Dana stared. You have footage? Richard's expression did not change. This is a hospital. Becker closed his eyes. Minutes passed. Finally, Becker exhaled. We agree. Richard inclined his head. Good. Dana looked shaken. You should know, she said quietly, this will not end here. Richard gathered his jacket. It never does. He left without another word. 2 floors below, Jack Harris stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of machines. His chest ached. His mind would not rest. He replayed moments from the emergency room, each dismissal now sharp with meaning. He wondered how many others had lain on that floor in different ways unseen. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Carol Whitman stood in the doorway. She looked smaller without the uniform authority. Her posture was rigid, as if bracing for impact. May I come in? She asked. Jack studied her face, the tension around her mouth, the dark circles she had once hidden with efficiency. Why, he asked. She swallowed. Because I owe you something. Jack gestured weakly. You're already here. She stepped inside and closed the door carefully. She did not sit. She clasped her hands until her knuckles whitened. I made a mistake. Jack watched her in silence. I told myself you were stable, she continued. That you could wait. That there were others worse off. Her voice cracked. I was wrong. Jack's chest tightened. He said nothing. She took a shaky breath. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've learned to triage people fast. Too fast. She looked at him, eyes shining. I didn't see you. I saw a problem I didn't want to deal with. The words hung heavy. You almost killed me, Jack said quietly. Her breath hitched. Yes. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want to be that person, she whispered. And because I know apologizing doesn't fix anything. Jack studied her. The woman before him was not the one who had dismissed him. She was older now, worn by consequence. What happens to you? He asked. Carol looked down. I don't know. Jack nodded. Neither do I. She nodded back, accepting the answer, then turned and left. Later that night, Richard returned. He stood by the window, city lights reflecting in the glass. They agreed. Jack exhaled slowly. To what? To stop pretending. Jack turned his head. You didn't do this for me. Richard met his gaze. No. For who then? Richard's voice was quiet. For everyone who didn't survive long enough to matter. Jack lay back, the weight of that settling deep. Outside the hospital, lights burned steadily, unaware that its walls had been forced to listen. And somewhere between the boardroom and the quiet room, the balance of who was seen and who was ignored had begun at last to shift. Jack was discharged at dawn, the sky still pale and undecided, the city holding its breath between night and morning. He moved slowly, each step measured pain kept in check by medication and pride. The wheelchair waited unnecessary, but offered. He waved it away and leaned on the wall instead, feeling the building's cold certainty against his shoulder. A nurse watched him go with an expression that mixed relief and unease. The hospital smelled different now, less neutral, sharper. Outside, a black sedan idled at the curb. Richard stood beside it, coat-buttoned hands bare despite the chill. He didn't rush to help, didn't hover. He waited, eyes tracking Jack's gait, noting the slight hitch on the left, the shallow breaths. You shouldn't be walking, Richard said. Jack snorted. I've been walking through worse. Richard opened the car door anyway. Jack accepted the help this time, lowering himself into the seat with a careful exhale. The door closed with a soft, final sound. They drove in silence at first. The city slid by in gray bands, early commuters, delivery trucks, a man walking a dog that refused to hurry. Jack broke the quiet. They'll forget. Richard glanced at him. Who the board, the nurses, everyone who looked past me. Jack stared out the window. They always do. Richard's jaw tightened. Not this time. Jack turned. You can't police memory. No, Richard said, but I can make forgetting expensive. Jack studied him. That's the part that worries me. Richard smiled faintly. It should. The car stopped at a red light. A woman crossed in front of them, scarf pulled tight, eyes down. Jack watched her pass. You're not just a concerned bystander. Richard did not answer immediately. The light turned green. The car moved. You already know that, Richard said. Jack sighed. I know you're powerful. I don't know what kind. Richard's gaze stayed on the road. The kind that doesn't need to be liked. Jack nodded slowly. That's a dangerous kind. Yes, Richard said. It is. They pulled up in front of Jack's building, a modest brick walk up with a stoop worn smooth by decades of feet. The sedan looked out of place, too clean, too quiet. Jack hesitated, then turned to Richard. What happens now? Richard met his eyes. Now you recover, and then you tell the truth when asked. And if I don't want to? Richard considered that. Then I'll still tell it. I'd prefer not to speak for you. Jack opened the door. Cold air rushed in. I don't like being a symbol. Richard nodded. Neither did my brother. Jack paused, one foot on the pavement. You keep bringing him up. Richard's voice was calm. Because he keeps showing up. Jack closed the door gently and stood on the sidewalk watching the car pull away. He felt smaller without it, lighter too, exposed. Inside his apartment, the silence was different from the hospital's. Honest. Dust motes floated in the slanted light. He lowered himself onto the couch and closed his eyes. The phone rang less than an hour later. A woman's voice clipped professional. Mr. Harris, this is Dana Keene from the hospital. The board would like to invite you to speak at a public session. Jack rubbed his temples. Public. Yes. When? Tomorrow. Jack laughed softly. You move fast. We're trying to do better. Jack pictured Richard's steady gaze. I'll be there. After the call ended, Jack sat still, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen. He thought of the floor, the guard's foot nudging his shoulder, the way the room had decided who he was without asking. He did not sleep much that night. The auditorium filled quickly the next day. Cameras, microphones, faces angled toward the stage. The hospital logo glowed behind the podium, crisp and reassuring. Jack waited in the wings jacket hanging looser on his frame. He felt older than he had a week ago. Not weaker, sharper. Richard stood nearby, hands clasped, expression unreadable. He wore a dark suit. This time nothing flashy, but the cut spoke of intention. People glanced at him, whispered, looked away. Dana approached. We'll begin shortly. Jack nodded. Do they expect an apology? Yes. Do they mean it? Dana hesitated. Some of them. Jack smiled thinly. That's honest. They took their places. The chairman spoke first. Words about regret, about commitment, about lessons learned. Applause followed, polite and restrained. Then Jack's name was called. He stepped into the light. The room quieted. He gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. He took a breath, slow, deliberate. "I didn't plan to be here," he said. His voice carried without strain. "I came to the emergency room because my chest hurt and my arm went numb. I thought that was enough." A murmur moved through the crowd. "I waited. I fell. I waited some more." He paused. "I was lucky." He looked out at the audience at the cameras. "Luck is not a system." Silence. "I'm not here because I want revenge," Jack continued. "I'm here because I don't want to be the last man who survives the floor." A few heads bowed. A woman wiped her eyes. Jack finished and stepped back. The applause was louder this time. Uncomfortable. Earnest. Richard watched him, something like approval flickering across his face. Afterward, in the corridor, a man in an expensive suit approached Jack, hand extended. "You were very brave." Jack did not take the hand. "I was very sick." The man flushed. Richard intervened smoothly. "If you'll excuse us." They walked together toward the exit. Reporters called out questions. Richard ignored them. In the car, Jack sagged against the seat. "I did it." "You did," Richard said. Jack turned to him. "What now?" Richard's expression shifted just slightly. "Now comes the part where people test whether this was a moment or a movement." Jack closed his eyes. "And you—" "I don't test," Richard said. "I verify." The car merged into traffic. The city resumed its rhythm. Jack felt the ache in his chest, the scar beneath his skin, the memory of the floor. He felt, too, a strange steadiness growing, the kind that comes after being knocked down and choosing to stand anyway. Ahead the road narrowed, then opened again. Richard watched the mirrors, the intersections, the people who would pretend nothing had changed. Something had, and he intended to make sure it stayed that way. The first letter arrived 3 days later, slipped under Jack's door like a warning. No return address. Thick paper. Legal weight. He read it standing, heart steady this time, fingers still sore from IV bruises. It was a notice of intent, a formal acknowledgement that his testimony had triggered external reviews, compliance audits, and temporary closures of 2 emergency intake lanes. The language was careful, bloodless, but the meaning was clear. Things were moving. The second letter came the next morning, this one less polite. It accused him of exaggeration, of misrepresentation. It suggested delicately that public statements could expose him to liability if proven inaccurate. Jack laughed when he read that one. A dry sound. He placed it on the table beside his medication and stared at the wall until the laughter faded. By afternoon, his phone would not stop ringing. Old colleagues, former clients, a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years. Some wanted to congratulate him. Others wanted him to be careful. A few wanted him to stop. He ignored most of them. The knock came just after sunset. Jack opened the door to find Linda Morales standing in the hallway, clutching a grocery bag like an offering. She looked smaller out here without the hospital's fluorescent glare. Older. Tired. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she said quickly. "I saw the interview." Jack stepped aside. "Come in." She placed the bag on the counter, unpacked without being asked. Soup, crackers, fruit, the things people bring when they don't know what else to do. "They're talking about you," she said. "At the hospital." Jack leaned against the counter. "I know. Some are angry. Also not surprising." She hesitated. "Some are scared." That caught his attention. "Of what?" She met his eyes. "Of being seen." Jack considered that. "Good." She smiled, relieved. "Richard Hale scares them more." Jack raised an eyebrow. Does he scare you? Linda thought for a moment. No. He reminds me of my father. Quiet. Didn't waste words. You knew when you'd crossed a line. Jack nodded. That tracks. She glanced around the apartment. You all right? He shrugged. Healing. She hesitated at the door before leaving. You did the right thing. Jack watched her go, then closed the door gently. That night the news broke wider. Headlines about systemic failure, about oversight, about a prominent investor pressing for reform. Richard's name appeared more frequently now, though still framed carefully. Philanthropist, advocate, silent partner. Jack watched from his couch remote resting on his knee. He saw his own face on the screen, older than he felt, eyes steady. He did not recognize the man the anchors described. Brave, reluctant hero, symbol. He turned the television off. The call from Richard came just before midnight. They're circling, Richard said without preamble. Jack closed his eyes. Who? Everyone who benefits from things staying quiet. Jack exhaled slowly. I expected that. Good, Richard said, because it's about to get louder. Jack sat up. I didn't agree to become leverage. Richard's voice remained calm. You didn't become it. You revealed it. Silence stretched. What do you need from me? Jack asked. Nothing you don't choose, Richard said. But you should know. There will be pushback. Personal. Subtle at first. Jack pictured the second letter. Already started. Richard paused. Then we're on schedule. Jack grimaced. That's not comforting. No, Richard agreed. It's accurate. They ended the call without ceremony. The following week, the hospital released surveillance footage. Not all of it. Enough. Enough to show Jack collapsing. Enough to show staff walking past. Enough to show time passing. The response was immediate. Outrage. Defensiveness. Think pieces. Calls for resignations. Jack stopped going outside. Then came the subpoena. It arrived by courier, heavy envelope, crisp seal. Jack read it twice, then sat down slowly. Richard was at his door within the hour. He took in the envelope, Jack's expression, the tension in the room. Civil action, he said. Jack nodded. They're claiming defamation. Richard exhaled through his nose. Of course they are. Jack's jaw tightened. I told the truth. I know. That's not always enough. Richard's gaze sharpened. It is if you're prepared. Jack laughed once. Prepared for what I'm still recovering. Richard stepped closer. Prepared to stand when they try to make you sit down again. Jack studied him. You talk like this is a chessboard. Richard did not deny it. It is. And what am I? Jack asked. A piece. Richard's expression softened just slightly. You're the reason the board matters. Jack turned away. I didn't ask for this. No, Richard said quietly. But you were chosen the moment they ignored you. Jack closed his eyes, anger flaring. You keep saying that like it's fate. Richard's voice hardened. It's not fate. It's consequence. They stood in silence. Finally, Jack spoke. What do you want me to do? Richard met his gaze. I want you to tell the truth again. This time under oath. Jack swallowed. And if I lose, Richard did not hesitate. You won't. That's not an answer. Richard stepped back, giving him space. If they try to ruin you, he said they will fail. Jack's eyes narrowed. You sound very sure. Richard's voice dropped. I am. Another knock interrupted them, this one sharper. Urgent. A man stood outside, early 40s suit, wrinkled eyes darting. Mr. Harris, I'm with the State Medical Board. Jack felt his stomach drop. Richard stepped forward, calm as ever. You're early. The man blinked. Excuse me? Richard smiled thinly. You were planning to come tomorrow. The man stiffened. How would you come in? Richard said, already turning. We were expecting you. Jack stared at him as the man stepped inside. Confusion and something like awe colliding in his chest. The investigator cleared his throat. This is informal. Richard nodded. It always starts that way. Jack sat down slowly, pulse quickening. As the questions began, he realized something unsettling and steadying all at once. This was no longer about one hospital, or one collapse. This was about systems that survived on silence and what happened when that silence broke. And Richard Hale was not reacting. He was orchestrating. Jack answered carefully, honestly feeling the weight of each word. He saw the investigator's pen pause more than once, saw interest sharpen into concern. When the man finally left the apartment, felt smaller. Jack turned to Richard. You knew this was coming. Yes. And you didn't warn me. Richard met his eyes. You needed to experience it without fear. Jack laughed shaky. That's one way to put it. Richard's gaze held his. They will try to isolate you next. Jack's smile faded. How? By making you doubt why you started. Jack thought of the floor. The guard's foot, the ceiling lights. I won't forget, he said. Richard nodded. Good, because the next phase requires memory. Jack leaned back, exhausted, adrenaline humming beneath his skin. What phase is that? Richard's eyes darkened. The one where they learn who they were actually dealing with. Jack's breath caught, not from fear, but from the sense that something vast and controlled was finally beginning to move. Outside, sirens wailed and faded. Inside, the quiet felt temporary. The hearing room smelled like old paper and new fear. Jack sat at the narrow table, hands folded, suit jacket hanging looser than it used to. The scar beneath his shirt tugged when he breathed too deeply. Across from him, 3 attorneys arranged their notes with ceremonial care, as if order alone could restore control. The judge had not yet entered. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Richard sat 2 rows back alone, posture relaxed, eyes sharp. He did not look at Jack. He did not need to. Jack felt him there the way you feel weather changing. The bailiff called the room to order. Chairs scraped. Everyone stood. The judge entered, took her seat, and nodded once. Proceedings began. The hospital's attorney spoke first. Smooth voice, careful phrasing. He talked about unfortunate timing, about ambiguity, about pressures of triage. He used Jack's name once like a courtesy. Mostly, he spoke as if Jack were an idea. Jack listened jaw tight. He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed answers in the quiet hours before dawn. Still, the old instinct tugged at him. Stay calm. Stay reasonable. Don't give them a reason to dismiss you. When it was his turn, he rose slowly. The room felt smaller standing. He placed one hand on the table to steady himself. State your name for the record, the clerk said. Jack Harris. Proceed. Jack looked at the judge, then deliberately at the attorney who had tried to erase him with words. I came to the emergency room because I thought I was dying, he said. I was. The attorney shifted. I was not confused. I was not intoxicated. I was not disruptive. I was quiet. I waited. I collapsed. The judge leaned forward slightly. Jack continued, voice steady. I was stepped over. I was evaluated without being examined. I was deprioritized without assessment. The hospital's attorney rose. Objection. Speculation. Jack did not look at him. I am describing what happened to my body. The judge nodded. Overruled. Jack exhaled slow. I survived because someone chose to intervene, not because the system worked. Silence followed. The attorney sat. When Jack finished, he returned to his seat, pulse racing. His palms were damp. He resisted the urge to look back at Richard. The next witness was called. Carol Whitman took the stand. She looked different under oath. Smaller. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. She described the shift, the crowding, the pressure. She described her decision. She did not excuse it. I made a judgment call, she said. It was wrong, the attorney pressed. You followed protocol. Carol swallowed. I followed habit. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge's gaze sharpened. Explain. Carol lifted her chin. We learn who to worry about, who to escalate. It's not written, but it's taught. The room stilled. The hospital's attorney objected again. The judge overruled again. Carol's eyes flicked toward Jack. I saw a man on the floor, she said quietly, and I chose not to see a crisis. Jack's throat tightened. After her testimony, the hearing recessed. People stood whispered, stretched. Jack remained seated, staring at the table, the grain of the wood suddenly fascinating. Richard moved to sit beside him. You did well, he said softly. Jack shook his head. I told the truth. Richard nodded. Exactly. Jack glanced at him. They're not done. No, Richard agreed. They're testing. The judge returned. The hearing resumed. A new witness took the stand. Not a nurse, not a doctor, an administrator from compliance, mid-50s. Careful smile. He spoke of audits and corrective action plans. He spoke of training modules and culture shifts. The judge listened. Then asked a question. How many similar incidents occurred in the past 5 years? The administrator hesitated. That depends on how one defines similar. The judge did not blink. Define it narrowly. The administrator's throat bobbed. 37! The room reacted this time. Audible, uncontrolled. Jack's breath caught. 37. The judge wrote something down. And how many resulted in public reporting? The administrator's voice dropped. None. Silence returned heavier now. The judge leaned back. We will adjourn for deliberation. People stood again. Jack remained seated, heart pounding. Richard watched the judge leave, then turned to Jack. Whatever happens, he said, remember this moment. Jack nodded. I will. They exited into the hallway. Cameras waited. Reporters surged. Questions flew. Jack froze. Richard stepped forward, placing himself between Jack and the noise. He did not touch him. He did not speak. He simply stood. The crowd hesitated. The cameras adjusted. Jack felt the weight lift just enough to breathe. They moved through and into the elevator. The doors closed. Silence returned, sudden and thick. Jack let out a shaky laugh. That was something. Richard looked at him. It was necessary. Jack leaned against the wall. You planned this. Richard did not deny it. I prepared for it. Same thing. Richard's eyes softened. No. Planning removes choice. Preparation respects it. Jack considered that. You're good at this. Richard's gaze flicked to the numbers above the door. I've had practice. The elevator opened. They stepped into the lobby. Outside, the city buzzed oblivious. Jack turned to Richard. What if they retaliate? Richard's expression hardened. They already are. Jack frowned. How Richard checked his phone. A suit was filed an hour ago. Against me. Jack stared. For what tortious interference, Richard said calmly. Intimidation. Influence. Jack's stomach dropped. Because of me. Richard met his eyes. Because of themselves. Jack shook his head. I didn't want Richard cut him off gently. Stop. This is not your burden. Jack swallowed. You could walk away. Richard smiled thinly. I won't. They walked to the car. Richard opened the door, then paused. There's something you should know. Jack looked up. What Richard's voice lowered. This hospital is not the first. Jack's breath caught. How many Richard's gaze stayed on the street? Enough. Jack nodded slowly. Then this is bigger than us. Yes, Richard said. That's the point. The car pulled away. Jack watched the courthouse recede in the mirror. For the first time since the floor, he did not feel small. He felt watched, counted, part of something unfolding with momentum he could not stop, and beside him sat a man who did not intend to let it slow. The retaliation did not come loudly. It arrived in the form of silence. Jack noticed it first in the small things. Emails unanswered. Calls redirected to voicemail. A scheduled follow-up appointment quietly canceled, then rescheduled weeks out without explanation. When he asked why, the clerk's voice tightened. System error, she said too quickly. Richard noticed it in the market. 3 nonprofit boards withdrew funding commitments overnight. A logistics contract stalled at the regulatory level for no stated reason. An old partner stopped returning calls, then sent a single line by text. I can't be seen with this right now. Richard read the message without expression and deleted it. They're testing the perimeter, he said later, standing in Jack's living room as dusk bled into night. Seeing how isolated they can make you. Jack sat on the couch, ice pack against his chest. They're doing a good job. Richard turned to him. No, they're doing an obvious one. Jack frowned. What's the difference? Obvious means traceable, Richard said. Traceable means careless. Jack studied him. You sound almost pleased. Richard's mouth curved faintly. I prefer honesty to subtlety. It shortens timelines. The knock came as if summoned. Jack stiffened. Richard raised a hand calm and moved to the door. He opened it to reveal a woman in her early 50s, hair-silvered posture, rigid with purpose. She wore a state-issued badge clipped to her blazer. Richard Hale, she said. I'm Deputy Attorney General Susan Mallory. Richard stepped aside. You're early. She blinked. Excuse me. You were going to wait until the morning, he said. But someone panicked. Susan's eyes sharpened. May we come in? Richard glanced back at Jack, then nodded. They sat at the table. Susan placed a folder between them. Thick, heavier than paper should feel. We've received multiple complaints, she began, alleging coordinated pressure on public institutions, interference, retaliation. Jack's stomach tightened. Richard leaned back. By whom? Susan held his gaze. By you. Richard nodded once. That was inevitable. Jack looked between them. This is about me. Susan turned to him. Mr. Harris, you are a witness in an ongoing inquiry. You are not under investigation. Richard interjected calmly. Yet. Susan's jaw set. Mr. Hale, your involvement complicates matters. Richard smiled thinly. Truth often does. She opened the folder. You have influence, financial, political, social. Richard nodded again. Yes. You used it, she continued. I exercised it, Richard corrected. Within the law. Susan's gaze flicked to Jack, then back. That remains to be determined. Jack spoke before fear could stop him. People almost died. Susan met his eyes. I know. Richard watched her closely. Then ask better questions. She paused. Such as, why oversight failed repeatedly, Richard said. Why complaints vanished. Why internal reviews produced no consequences until cameras were involved. Susan's expression shifted, calculation replacing formality. You're suggesting institutional negligence. I'm stating it, Richard replied. Silence stretched. Susan closed the folder. There will be a grand jury. Jack's breath caught. Richard nodded. Good. Susan studied him. You're not worried. I'm prepared, Richard said. There's a difference. She stood. Mr. Harris, you may be called again. Jack swallowed. I'll tell the truth. Susan nodded. I expect nothing less. She turned to Richard. And you? Richard met her gaze. I already have. After she left, the apartment felt charged like air before a storm. Jack rubbed his face. This is spiraling. Richard poured himself water unhurried. This is clarifying. Jack stared at him. You're enjoying this. Richard shook his head. No, I'm finishing it. Jack stood slowly, pain flaring, anger sharper. You said this wasn't about me. It isn't, Richard said evenly. It's about what happens when systems believe no one is watching. And I'm just proof. Your testimony, Richard corrected. There's a difference. Jack exhaled, frustrated. I didn't ask to be a catalyst. No one ever does, Richard said softly. That's why they work. The next day, the story broke wider. Not about Jack. About Richard. An investigative piece traced his investments across healthcare networks, regulatory bodies, philanthropic foundations. It hinted at influence. It asked questions. It implied motive. Jack watched the segment with a knot in his chest. They're painting you as the villain. Richard watched, two expression unreadable. They need one. Jack turned to him. You could shut this down. Yes. Why don't you? Richard's gaze stayed on the screen. Because then they'd be right. The phone rang. Richard answered without looking at the number. Yes, he said. No. I won't comment. A pause. Release the documents. He ended the call. Jack stared. What documents? Richard met his eyes. The ones they assumed I'd keep quiet. By evening, the counterstrike landed. Emails, memos, recorded meetings, proof of suppressed reports. Internal communications, debating optics over outcomes. A timeline that did not flatter anyone. The narrative shifted. Susan Mallory held a press conference before nightfall. This inquiry is broader than a single incident, she said. It concerns systemic failures and deliberate concealment. Jack watched from his couch, heart pounding. They're going to come after you harder, he said. Richard nodded. Yes, and you're fine with that. Richard looked at him. Are you? Jack thought of the floor, the waiting, the silence. Yes, he said, I am. Later, when the city quieted, Jack found Richard on the balcony, phone in hand, eyes on the lights below. You never told me, Jack said. Richard turned. Told you what? Why you do this. Richard considered him for a long moment. Because I learned early that apologies don't move systems. Leverage does. Jack nodded slowly. And because of your brother. Richard's jaw tightened. Yes. Jack stepped closer. What happens if this costs you everything? Richard's gaze held his. Then it will have been expensive enough to matter. Jack felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, resolve. In the distance, sirens wailed and faded. Inside, two men stood at the center of a widening circle, no longer reacting, no longer waiting. The silence they had broken would not return quietly. The verdict did not come with applause. It arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, folded into a press release written in careful language that tried to soften what could not be softened. The grand jury findings confirmed systemic negligence, willful suppression of incident reports, and coordinated efforts to minimize liability at the expense of patient safety. Multiple administrators were indicted. Several licenses were suspended, pending permanent revocation. Federal oversight was imposed effective immediately. Jack read the statement twice, then set it down and closed his eyes. His chest ached not from the scar this time, but from the weight of finality. It was over. Or at least this part was. Across the room, Richard watched him quietly, coffee untouched in his hand. The television murmured with expert commentary phrases like watershed moment and institutional reckoning looping endlessly. "They're calling it historic," Jack said. Richard nodded. "They always do when something survives long enough to be undeniable." Jack opened his eyes. "People are going to lose everything." Richard's gaze stayed steady. "They already did. The difference is that now it has names." Jack absorbed that in silence. By noon, the calls began again. This time they carried a different tone. Invitations, panels, requests to consult, advocacy groups asking Jack to lend his voice, his face, his story. He declined most of them. "I don't want to become a career witness," he said later, standing by the window as traffic crawled below. Richard joined him. "You don't have to," Jack turned. "But you want me to?" Richard considered that. "I want you to choose what happens next, instead of reacting to what already did." Jack exhaled slowly. "I'm tired. I know." The phone rang again. Jack ignored it. Richard watched him, then spoke carefully. "There's something you should see." Jack frowned. "More documents?" "No." Richard picked up his tablet, slid it across the table. A draft. Jack sat curious despite himself. He read in silence, brow furrowing. Proposed legislation. Clear language. Mandatory escalation standards. Independent reporting channels. Whistleblower protections with teeth. Funding mechanisms. Enforcement clauses that did not rely on goodwill. Jack looked up. "This is real." "It will be," Richard said. "If someone is willing to stand behind it publicly." Jack stared at him. "You." Richard shook his head. "Not me." Jack's pulse quickened. "You want me to." "I want it to belong to the people it's meant to protect," Richard said. "Not to a benefactor." Jack stood abruptly, pacing despite the twinge in his chest. "I'm not a politician. Neither am I. This would change everything." "Yes. And it would make me a target." Richard's voice softened. "You already are." Jack stopped pacing. "Why are you doing this?" Richard met his gaze. "Because I don't want this to end with punishment alone." Jack thought of the floor, the waiting, the 37 incidents. "You think laws fix morality?" "No," Richard said. "They limit its absence." Silence settled between them. That evening they attended the final press conference together. Not side by side. Intentionally separate. Jack at the podium, Richard in the back of the room. Jack spoke plainly. About what happened. About what almost happened. About how close the line really was. He did not dramatize. He did not perform. He finished with a single sentence. Survival should not depend on who notices. The room erupted in questions. Jack stepped away without answering them. Outside cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Richard waited until they were in the car. "You did well," he said. Jack leaned back, eyes closed. "I don't feel triumphant." Richard nodded. "You shouldn't." Jack opened his eyes. What about you? Richard looked out the window. I'll be busy. With what unwinding relationships that were built on silence? Jack grimaced. That sounds ugly. It is. The car moved through the city past hospitals and offices and people who would never know how close they'd come to being invisible. Days passed, then weeks. The world adjusted. The hospital board was replaced, new leadership installed, oversight committees formed, training protocols rolled out with deadlines and penalties attached. Jack returned to the emergency room once quietly at night. He stood near the spot where he had fallen. The floor gleamed. A plaque had been installed nearby, small, discreet about patient safety commitments. It felt inadequate. It also felt like something. Richard waited by the doors. You didn't have to come, Jack said. Yes, Richard replied. I did. They stood there for a moment, the past hovering between them. Jack spoke softly. You never told me what you lost. Richard's jaw tightened. Some friends, some contracts, a few illusions. Jack nodded. Worth it. Richard met his eyes. Ask me in 10 years. Jack smiled faintly. I will. Outside, the night air was cool. The city pulsed. Jack took a breath. I've been thinking. That's dangerous, Richard said dryly. Jack ignored him. If I do this, the bill, the advocacy, I don't want it tied to you. Richard inclined his head. Good. I want it independent. Better. And I want you nowhere near the spotlight. Richard smiled thinly. I don't like the spotlight. Jack studied him. That's not true. Richard's eyes flicked to him. I don't like sharing it. Jack laughed, the sound surprising both of them. The laughter faded, leaving something quieter, steadier. You changed my life, Jack said. Richard shook his head. You reclaimed it. Jack considered that, then nodded. Fair. They walked to the car. As they drove away, Jack watched the hospital recede in the mirror. It looked smaller now, not powerless, just accountable. He felt the scar pull as he shifted, a reminder etched into his body. This was not an ending. It was a line drawn. And for the first time since that cold floor, Jack knew exactly where he stood. The morning Jack stood before the committee room in Albany, the scar beneath his shirt felt less like a wound and more like an anchor. The room was smaller than the auditorium, quieter, lined with wood that had absorbed decades of arguments and promises. No cameras this time. No flashing lights. Just people with notepads and tired eyes who had learned to be skeptical for a living. Jack took his seat, hands steady. Across from him, lawmakers shuffled papers, staffers whispered. The air hummed with anticipation, not drama. Richard was not there. That had been the agreement. Jack spoke without notes. He talked about escalation thresholds and reporting gaps, about how silence formed, how it spread, how it learned to sound reasonable. He spoke as someone who had been inside the consequence, not above it. When he finished, there was no applause, just nods, pens moving faster. Outside, the sky was bright, unseasonably clear. Jack walked down the steps, alone, breathing in the cold air, feeling something he hadn't expected. Lightness. Not relief. Not victory. Lightness. The work did not end there. It became meetings and drafts and revisions. Long days that left him tired in a way that felt earned. He learned the language of policy without letting it erase the language of people. He insisted on clarity where others preferred abstraction. The bill moved, slowly at first, then faster. Opposition came quieter, now careful. Arguments about cost, about feasibility, about unintended consequences. Jack listened, responded, adjusted where it made sense, and held firm where it didn't. Richard followed from a distance. They spoke less frequently now, not because of tension, but because the shape of their connection had changed. Less urgency, more trust. When they did talk, it was brief. Progress updates, warnings, occasionally a dry comment that cut through the weight of it all. "You're getting good at this," Richard said once. Jack smiled. "Don't tell anyone." The vote came on a Friday afternoon. Jack sat in the gallery, heart-pounding, fingers laced together. Names were called. A chorus of yes and no measured, recorded. When it passed narrowly but cleanly, Jack did not move. He stayed seated as people stood, talked, shook hands. He stayed until the room emptied, until the echoes faded. Only then did he exhale. The next months reshaped his days. Hospitals began implementing changes, not because they wanted praise, but because the penalties were real. Reporting lines strengthened, training sharpened. Quiet patterns broke under scrutiny. Jack visited one emergency room late at night unannounced. He watched the flow. He listened. He saw a nurse stop, hesitate, then escalate. It mattered. He returned home afterward and sat in the dark, letting the reality settle. This was not a miracle. It was maintenance. It would require vigilance. He could live with that. Richard called that night. "They named the bill after you," he said. Jack groaned. "I told them not to. They did it anyway." Jack rubbed his face. "I hate that." Richard's voice softened. "Names fade. Systems last." Jack nodded, even though Richard couldn't see it. "Thank you." "For what?" "For knowing when to step back." A pause. Then, "That's harder than stepping in." They did not say goodbye. They rarely did. The city adjusted, as cities always do. Stories moved on. Headlines shifted. New outrages competed for attention. But something fundamental had changed quietly. People waited less. They were heard sooner. Jack noticed it one evening when he passed the hospital again, not to look back, but simply because it was on his way home. He paused across the street, watching ambulances arrive, doors opening, staff moving with purpose. No one lay on the floor. He kept walking. Later in his apartment, Jack sat at his desk, the same desk where letters had once piled up with threats and warnings. Now there were notes from nurses, from patients, from families who never knew how close they'd come to loss. He read them slowly. One letter stood out. Simple, handwritten. "You didn't know us. You still helped." Jack folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. The scar pulled when he stood, a quiet reminder that the body remembers even when the mind moves forward. He accepted that. He turned off the light and looked out at the city, alive and indifferent and worth the effort anyway. Somewhere out there, systems still failed. People were still missed, but fewer, and fewer mattered. That was enough to keep going. If this story meant something to you, if you believe attention can save lives and silence can cost them, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments with these 3 words: dignity over indifference.